When most people think of big block engines from the 1960s and early 1970s, you often think of something that's got really good power and at least great torque. And, well, that's generally true in most cases. Most big block V8s that were produced, particularly before emission standards really became prevalent in the early 1970s, were rather powerful. And there were some especially, let's say, high horsepower variants of these big block V8s. One of the things that you may not know is that at the opposite end of the spectrum, there was also a very strange combination, at least with General Motors and to some degree Ford, with big block V8s, and that is big blocks with two-barrel carburetors. Yes, I said that right, two-barrel carburetors. And let's just talk a little bit about how this came about and where it seemingly began. Now, two-barrel carburetors are nothing new. They have been used on vehicles for many, many years, and four-barrel carburetors were, in some cases, deemed a luxury. In fact, Robert McNamara in the early 1960s basically said that all Fords really can't have anything more than two-barrel carburetors on them unless there's some super performance vehicle. And so as an example, Lincoln in 1960 on their huge 430 cubic inch MEL V8 had a two-barrel carburetor, whereas in 1958 and 1959, that engine came with a four-barrel carburetor. And by the time the late 1960s, early 1970s rolled around, and Ford really sunset the MEL and FE V8s, at least in passenger cars, and replaced them with the 429s and later the 460s in the Fords, Mercurys, and Lincolns, or the 460s from the get-go in the Lincolns. The two-barrel carburetor was really not to be found on a number of those variants. The 460s never had two-barrel carburetors, but Ford did put two barrels on their 429s in a number of vehicles, including as standard equipment in many Mercurys of that era. But over at GM, this two-barrel big block phenomenon was much larger and, I would say, more prevalent. And I believe it really started with Oldsmobile. Now, Oldsmobile was the first of the GM divisions to introduce a 455 cubic inch V8, and it came out in 1968. Pontiac would introduce theirs in 1970, and Buick would introduce their 455 in 1970. Of course, Chevrolet had a 454, which never came with a two-barrel carburetor, and Cadillac had its engines, 472, 500 cubic inches, and they always came with four-barrel carburetors as well. But for whatever reason, Oldsmobile in 1968 thought that it was a good idea to have a 455 cubic inch two-barrel carburetor engine as the standard engine in its Delta 88. Take a look here at this page out of the 1968 Oldsmobile brochure, and you can see the 320 horsepower Rocket 455 V8 is the standard engine in the Delta 88s. It was available in extra cost in the Del Monte 88s. It's a high compression 455, 10 1/4 to 1 compression, but notice the carburation that's listed there, a two-barrel carburetor. And the standard engine in the 98s, if you go one up from that and available in the 88s, was the same engine, same 455, same 10 1/4 to 1 compression ratio, but it has 365 horsepower because notice that it says there's a four-barrel carburetor. Now, interestingly, take a look beneath the 320 horsepower 455 and you see an entry for a 310 horsepower 455 cubic inch V8 that has a lower compression ratio associated with it. This is an economy 455 two-barrel low compression engine. This was the standard engine in Delta 88s, and you would get it if you had your vehicle equipped with a manual transmission. So I guess if you got the manual, you got the low compression gas saver 455, if you will, as opposed to the premium fuel higher compression 455. You also got a black air cleaner, by the way, on these economy Oldsmobile engines during this time frame. So I suppose Oldsmobile thought that it was perfectly logical because for a number of years they had a 425 cubic inch two-barrel V8, and they thought, well, this engine's a little bit bigger. It's 455 versus 425, but let's put the two-barrel carburetor on it and see what happens. And truth be told, it really was a pleasant engine. Of course, you don't have the four-barrel carburation that you would with a four-barrel carburetor, so consequently you don't have as much air and fuel being able to be put in the engine to make as much power. But at normal speeds, actually the two-barrel carburetors, when you drive two-barrel carbureted vehicles, whether it's GM, Ford, or Chrysler from this time frame, they actually tend to feel peppier around town than the four-barrel carburetors. Just a function of the jetting and the carburetor, and it actually works quite well. Now, if you floor it and you're looking for high RPM power, they obviously don't have quite as much as the four-barrel carbureted variants. But again, I've got a number of these two-barrel big blocks, and they work just fine. I don't really miss the power of the four-barrel. Like I said, they feel peppier around town than the four-barrel. Now, Oldsmobile kind of set this trend because, as I mentioned, they were the first to introduce their 455 in 1968. It would take a few more years before Pontiac and Buick would introduce their 455s. Now, the strange thing for me is not that Oldsmobile continued this 455 two-barrel, because that's kind of expected. They would continue it up through, I believe, the 1971 model year. You could still get the 455 two-barrel V8 in Oldsmobiles, but by that point, the Oldsmobile V8 was a low-compression engine across the board. All General Motors engines beginning in 1971 were designed to run on unleaded gasoline, and as a result, the compression ratio was significantly debased from previous years, generally around 8-1, a little over 8-1 versus the 10-1 or higher of previous years. But in 1970, when Pontiac would introduce its 455, it would introduce it with only a four-barrel variant. Didn't matter, Bonneville, Catalina, whatever vehicle you got the 455 in, it came with a four-barrel carburetor in any form. There was no two-barrel 455. But strangely, when 1971 would come around, as you can see from the Pontiac brochure here, there would be a 455 cubic inch two-barrel V8. Now, in 1971, Pontiac would introduce its Grandville as the new top-of-the-line luxury leader for Pontiac, and that did come standard with a 455 cubic inch four-barrel V8. But take a look at this sheet from the Bonneville, and what do you notice? That the standard engine is a 455 two-barrel V8. And that 455 two-barrel would be an optional engine in all of the Pontiacs, except the performance vehicles like the Firebird and the GTO, that if you got a 455, you got the four-barrel V8. They didn't offer a 455 two-barrel in those cars. But as an example, if you got a low-end Catalina, you could option up away from your 350 or 400 to a 455 two-barrel. You can also see in this sheet from the 1971 Pontiac brochure that the two-barrel 455 made 280 gross horsepower, 190 net. 190 net horsepower, 455. If you got the four-barrel, you got 325 gross horsepower, 230 net. So it was 40 more net horsepower, 40, if you got a four-barrel carburetor in your 455 versus the two-barrel. And by the way, these ratings, the net horsepower ratings at least, not the gross, because the gross horsepower ratings don't take into account the exhaust systems. But the net horsepower ratings on these Pontiacs are associated with single exhaust variants. If you put dual exhaust on your Pontiac V8, you get around 25, 30 more horsepower. So you really could zip up your 455 quite cheaply. If you had one with a two-barrel, you put a four-barrel on it, you put dual exhaust, and you get 70 more horsepower than the 190 that it was making from the factory. Pontiac would continue the 455 two-barrel into the 1972 model year. So it continued it longer than Olds did, and I guess it was fine. Again, I haven't driven a Pontiac V8 with the two-barrel, but I've driven a number of Olds V8s with it, and I assume it was just fine, and customers tended to like it. But as the engine horsepower ratings would come down and emissions would become more prevalent, I think GM and other automakers just found they had to put the four barrels on these big blocks in order to get them the power. And also the four-barrel V8s, particularly the quadrajet carburetors, were helping with emission standards. In some cases, the California emissions cars, as an example, you had to get the four-barrel. And that's because the Venturis on the quadrajets, the primary Venturis, are smaller and promote better mixing when you're operating on them than even the two-barrel carburetors. So in a strange way, the four-barrel was actually more emission compliant and produced less emissions than the two-barrel, at least if you didn't step on it. Now, there's one other division here I mentioned that Buick also had a 455 cubic inch two-barrel V8. But it came very late in the game here, and they were actually the last that I know of to have a 455 with a two-barrel on top of it. The Buick 455 was introduced in 1970, and again, it was a high compression engine. It was only around for 1 year before it would be demoted to a low compression engine in 1971. The Buick 455 would carry on through 1976, but it really was almost always offered with a four-barrel carburetor except for one model here, and that was 1974. For whatever reason, in 1974, Buick decided that it needed a 455 cubic inch two-barrel V8, and strangely, this was an optional V8. If you got an Electra or an Electra Estate wagon, you got the big 455 four-barrel, but if you got a LeSabre, which came standard with a 350 two-barrel, you could option up to a 350 four-barrel, but then you could option to a 455 two-barrel V8. Now, why, again, Buick decided that it needed this extra variant that didn't even come standard in the Electra, I have no idea. But to my knowledge, they were the last to put a two-barrel carburetor on a 455 cubic inch big block. And you can see the dismal horsepower ratings down there, 175 horsepower with single exhaust from a 455 cubic inch engine. I also think that this is the lowest horsepower rating of a passenger car big block engine that GM produced. Because by this point, all the other divisions had four barrels on their 455. Some weren't making much more horsepower. Candidly, they were making 190-ish horsepower in four-barrel form. But here, Buick at 175 horsepower from 7.5 liters. I guess the good news is that if you optioned up to dual exhaust, you got an extra 15 horsepower. You got 190 horsepower out of it in two-barrel form. I will say, take a look at the torque figures here, and you notice that the two-barrel V8 does offer 15, 20-ish pound-feet more of torque than the four-barrel V8. Not surprising, and as I mentioned, the two barrels do feel a little bit peppier around town, and in part, that's because of the torque curves, and in this case, actually higher torque ratings for the two-barrel variant of the Buick V8s. In any case, I thought you would find this discussion of a particularly strange variant for General Motors V8s interesting. I didn't even know, candidly, that Buick offered this 1974 455 two-barrel until I saw one in a junkyard in a LeSabre. I just couldn't believe it. I didn't even know that that was offered. I thought somebody put a different intake on a 455, and I looked it up, and it actually was a stock configuration. Now, as I mentioned, others had produced two barrels on top of big blocks like Ford with their 429, but there was no 460 two-barrel, as an example. There was no Chrysler 440 two-barrel. There was no AMC 401 two-barrel. So why General Motors and its various divisions elected to go this route with these engines, I'm not sure. But if you've had one of these, put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Do you like the idea? Do you think it's strange? Or what would you do? I will say that, again, these vehicles drive quite pleasantly. They do wheeze a little at upper RPMs, but the Rochester 2GC carburetor, the two-barrel that GM used, was actually a really, really good two-barrel, and it flowed more air, more cubic feet per minute than a comparable Ford Autolite two-barrel and others, Carter two-barrels. So it's not as wheezy as you might think. The Ford V8s, the big blocks with the two-barrel, in my experience, are a little wheezy at upper RPM range. But this Rochester 2GC, they could flow 500 CFM-ish in that zip code, so really wasn't bad from the perspective of a two-barrel. And candidly, they work quite well. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.